You're listening to the Hard Truth Podcast with Adam Aziz. This special series is based on Adam's book, Call a Thing a Thing. In today's episode, Adam will reveal the power of truth and the role it plays in our freedom. He will teach us how to look right at a thing, call it by its name, and decide what role it will or will not play in our lives, because the truth is the only safe ground to stand on. Now, here's your host, Adam Aziz.
Hey everyone, today's episode we're going to be talking about interrupting the story. Everyone has a story, and everyone tells a story. I want to ask you, what story are you telling? What story are you telling yourself? What story are you telling others? Some of us are living in stories of rejection or trauma. Some of us are replaying stories of betrayal or heartbreak or failure. Some of us are stuck in the same old chapter. And in order for the story to change, we have to come to the revelation, it ain't working. The story I'm telling, the story I'm living, it ain't working. Holding on to the rejection and the trauma, being angry and bitter, it ain't working. The bad habit, the defeated mindset, the bad attitude, my pride, ain't working. Worrying and doubting, doing life my way, ain't working. Continuing to look back instead of looking forward, it ain't working. That thing, whatever it may be, ain't working. It's holding me back. It's stunting my growth. It's crushing my spirit. It's killing my joy. I came to a place where the story I was living and I was telling wasn't working. There was a point in my life where I was 345 pounds and counting. And let me be clear, I wasn't just carrying pounds. I was carrying patterns. I was carrying pain. I was carrying perspectives that kept me stuck. And the way I was living, the way I was thinking, the way I was coping with life, it wasn't working. And at that time, I was telling myself a story. Well, this is just how I am. I've always been big boned. I've always been a big guy. I've got my eating under control. And I really love to tell this story. I love me. I love how I am. I love who I am. It doesn't matter what size I am. And what's funny about it is the people around me believed my story. They believed the lie that I was telling. Because when when I show people who knew me then, pictures of me then, the statement is always the same. I didn't realize you were that big. I had no idea you had gained that much weight. And that story that I kept telling myself, it kept me comfortable in my dysfunction. That story was keeping me from facing the real root of what I was battling. What was I battling? I was battling fear. I was battling turning to food and not God. I was battling rejection. I was battling loneliness. I was battling bitterness and insecurity. And, one day I found myself in the middle of a major anxiety attack. My wife had to take me to the emergency room because I thought I was dying. And I found myself sitting in that emergency room and I said, Adam, this ain't working. This isn't who God called you to be. This is not what He has planned for your life. And I realized that I had settled for potential and not purpose. I realized that if I didn't let go of these things, I was never going to grab a hold of what God had for me. So what did I do? I interrupted the story. I had to confront patterns. I had to face pain. I had to deal with the root issues that were feeding my choices. And here is what I learned about interrupting the story. I learned three things. One, you got to set boundaries. If you're going to interrupt the story, you got to set some boundaries. Two, I had to understand that I mattered. If you're going to interrupt the story of your life, you've got to come to the revelation that you matter. Three, I had to confront the kings. There were some things in my life, if I was going to truly interrupt the story, I was going to have to confront some things. So let's talk about each of these for a minute. You got to set boundaries. Boundaries are essential. If you have unhealthy work habits, you got to set a boundary. If you're not taking time to exercise or eat healthy, you need to set a boundary. If you have unhealthy behaviors or patterns in a relationship, you need to set a boundary. If you're scrolling on social media all the time, set a boundary. If you replay conversations and situations in your mind, set a boundary. If every time that person calls, they drain you, you need to set a boundary. Healthy boundaries are not walls to block other people out. A boundary is a structure, an expectation, a request, a system that you put in place to define or prescribe or limit or exclude a behavior or people or experiences that are not in alignment with who you are, who you want to be, or where you're trying to go in life. Boundaries keep us focused and they keep us on course. Boundaries keep us aware of how far we can go and how much we can do. Boundaries make others aware of what we expect or accept or allow or accommodate or tolerate. Boundaries are biblical. Nehemiah set a boundary. He refused to come down from the wall. In Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 3, he says, I'm engaged in a great work, so I can't come. Why should I stop working to come and meet with you? When they were trying to distract Nehemiah with drama and meetings, he set a firm boundary. He said, no, I'm not coming down from the wall. He was able to do that because he knew that not every invitation requires your attendance. You have to protect your assignment at all costs. It is okay to say no. It is okay to say no to anything that does not align with your purpose, with who you are, who you want to be, or where you're trying to go. No is a complete sentence. You don't have to explain yourself. Paul set boundaries. He cut off relationships that hindered his mission. In Acts chapter 15, verse 36 through verse 40, we find Paul and Barnabas arguing over whether or not they're going to bring John Mark on their next missionary journey because John Mark had abandoned them earlier. So Paul set a boundary and said no, and he chose Silas to go with him instead. Sometimes setting boundaries means you got to redefine relationships for the sake of your purpose. Moses set boundaries for the people in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 26. Moses was wearing himself out, judging every little dispute that happened, amongst the Israelite people. So Jethro tells him, you're going to have to delegate and set some limits so you don't burn out. Boundaries, contrary to popular belief, are not selfish. They're not selfish. They're necessary for longevity and effectiveness. Jesus set boundaries. He often withdrew to pray. In Luke chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus set boundaries around his time with the Father. He didn't let the constant demands of the crowds and the disciples or the ministry keep him from recharging spiritually. Sometimes you have to step away from people to stay full and focused. Jesus also refused to be controlled by the agenda of others. In John chapter 6, verse 15, it tells us that when Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. You see, people tried to force their agenda on him, but Jesus didn't let them, override his mission. Let me tell you something. If you don't set your own boundaries, other people will start setting them for you. You can't worry about what other people think or how they feel about your boundaries. Because you'll find that the only people who have a problem with you setting a boundary are the people who are benefiting from you not having one. So you got to set healthy boundaries for your life and interrupt the pattern or the story that you want to change. Not only do you need to set a boundary, but you need to understand that you matter. If you're going to interrupt the story, you got to come to that revelation that you matter. Who you are matters. What you do matters. How you do what you do matters. You matter. And your no matters. Your yes matters. Let me tell you something. I used to be a yes person. I said yes to everything. And I always said yes because I was afraid that if I said no, you weren't going to like me or love me. My validation, my sense of acceptance and accomplishment came from pleasing you with my yes. Even if that, meant at the expense of my peace or my rest or my joy or my family or my health or my purpose. You must be able to say no to the things that do not honor you, bring you joy, or bring you peace. Don't you ever back up on your no. Don't draw a line in the sand and then when someone crosses it, back up and draw another line. No. No means no. Stand on your line and stand in your no. You see, when you understand that you matter, you stand in your no and you stand for your yes. What do I mean? You say no to overtime so you can say yes to dinner with your family. You say no to toxic texts so you can say yes to peace. You say no to buying it now so you can say yes to getting out of debt. You say no to fast food so you can say yes to health goals. You say no to people pleasing so you can say yes to living authentically. You say no to scrolling late at night so you can say yes to rest and focus. You say no to drama so you can say yes to your purpose. You interrupt the story. You interrupt the pattern in your life by letting no mean no and yes mean yes. For example, my health journey. I had to really mean yes to my health and no to my old way of living if I was ever going to change. Jesus said in Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Listen, you matter. And what you think, it matters. Stop thinking about what they said or what they did. Stop rehearsing that argument or that disagreement in your mind. Stop thinking about what might happen or worrying about what could be. If your thoughts do not bring you peace, stop thinking them. Let me tell you something. You do not have to entertain every little thought that pops into your head. Oftentimes I will envision myself when I start having these, intrusive thoughts or my mind starts racing and wondering. I will oftentimes envision myself slamming a door. Listen, you've got to change your thoughts if you're going to change your life. You matter. And not only what you think matters, but how you show up, it matters. Every moment of every day, no matter where you are, what you're doing, or who you're with, you matter because you are demonstrating the power and the love and the Spirit of God in everything that you do and in everything that you say. So how you show up in a room, looking and acting, it matters. Stop showing up broken and depressed, bitter, angry, resentful, worried, anxious, tired, pitiful. Stop showing up looking like the victim, looking defeated. Stop showing up looking like what you've been through. What you do matters and how you do it matters. Moment by moment, you must remind yourself how I'm showing up, how I'm standing, how I'm speaking in this moment, how I'm sharing who I am and whose I am in this moment, how I am being and acting in this moment. It matters because I matter. Not only do you need to understand that you matter, but if you're going to interrupt the story, you got to confront the kings. In the book of Joshua, we find God moving Israel into the promised land. And the thing is, They were only going to possess that promise if they fought for it. The same applies to you and me. God has promises for all of us. They belong to us. They're available to us. But we must possess them by fighting for them. And let me tell you something, the greater the promise, the greater the fight. If you are going to let go and conquer what's not working in and for your life, you're going to have to fight. You may have to confront some things, some traditions. You might have to break some habits. You might have to let go of some people. You might have to step out of your culture. You may have to unlearn something that you were taught as a child, whether it be a mindset or an attitude, a behavior, a way of being or doing things. You're going to have to fight. Now, in this fight, there are two forces you're fighting. The first one is external forces. That's people and situations, the devil. But most of the time, the fight is with an internal force. An internal force that is raging on the inside of us. Listen, we try to look cute. We try to look like we have it all together or we have it all figured out. But be not deceived. Everyone has something ugly up under all their cuteness. And I call it a thing. Now, other people may not see it because the fight is not external, it's internal. But let me tell you something. Not only is the fight on the inside, but the bleeding, the pain, the brokenness, the exhaustion, the hopelessness, the struggle, the wrestling is all happening on the inside. I want us to look at a story found in Joshua chapter 10. Now, this is a story about an external fight with people, but I want you to see it from an internal point of view. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 1 through 14, we find that Israel has gone into the promised land and they've won many victories. And the Gibeonites have chosen to make peace with Israel and become their allies. So King Adonizedek launches a campaign against the Gibeonites, and he rallies 5 other kings and their armies to fight. And in verse 5, it tells us that these 5 Amorite kings combined their armies for a united attack. They moved all their troops into place to attack Gibeon. So the Gibeonites, they send messages to Joshua at Gilgal, and they say, look, we teamed up with you, and now they're attacking us, so we need you to send us some help. We need backup. So Joshua and his entire army set out for Gibeon, and they travel all night. And Joshua gets there, and he finds himself exhausted. And so he prays a prayer in verse 12 and 13, and he says, let the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemies. Now, I want you to look at what happens starting in verse 15. It says, then Joshua and the Israelite army returned to their camp at Gilgal. During the battle, the 5 kings escaped and hid in a cave at Makkedah. Now, what we find here is that Joshua has these 5 enemy armies on the run. And so he and his men returned to their camp to get a little rest. And at that time, the 5 kings were so scared that they ran and they hid in a cave. Now, I want you to look at what happens and what Joshua does starting in verse 17. It says, when Joshua heard that they had been found, he issued this command. He says, cover the opening of the cave with large rocks and place guards at the entrance to keep the kings inside. The rest of you continue chasing the enemy and cut them down from the rear. Don't give them a chance to get back to their towns, for the Lord your God has given you victory over them. So you see, these 5 kings are hiding in this cave because they realize they're losing the battle. And all of this is happening in a place called Makkedah. Now, this is significant because Makkedah represents the promised land. The enemy is standing in the middle of the promise, but it belongs to Joshua and Israel. Now, when I read this, I ask myself the question, how did this happen? If the promise belonged to them, how is the enemy standing in the middle of their promise? And it's because previous generations fled from that land and other people moved in. You see, when you flee or run from a battle, you leave room for someone else to come in and take over. And so now Joshua finds himself standing in essentially a generational curse, and he's having to fight it. Now, if we look at it from that perspective, these 5 kings and their armies are what you would call a squatter. They're squatters. A squatter is someone who has no right to be in a place, but they've been there so long that they are determined that they're not going to go anywhere. These squatters had taken control and had taken possession of what rightfully belonged to Israel. I wonder how many squatters are sitting on things that belong to you right now. You see, you may have some things sitting on your peace and your joy. You may have some things that are sitting on your family or your finances or your career or your marriage or your ministry. You may have some things that are sitting on your future. And they've been sitting there so long, they're determined that they're not budging. They're not going to go anywhere. Let me tell you something. Matthew 11:12 says the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. Don't let that thing infect what God has for you. Don't you let it keep you stuck or hold you back. Don't let it convince you that it's too late or that it's hopeless. Don't let it destroy what God has said is rightfully yours. Don't you do it. You fight. You see, Joshua is fighting all these external forces, and these 5 kings hide in a cave. And so Joshua's men asked him, what do you want us to do with these kings? And he tells them, he says, roll a stone in front of it, because I still got some fighting I need to do. You see, sometimes you have to roll a stone in front of things you haven't conquered yet. What do I mean? I mean, you know that scrolling on social media pulls you into temptation. So for now, you delete the app because you know you're not strong enough yet to handle it. That's rolling the stone. Or you know your spending is out of control, so you cut up the credit card while you ask God to renew your mind about money. That's rolling the stone. Or you know that relationship is toxic and it keeps pulling you backwards, so you block their number because you don't trust yourself not to answer their call or their text. That's rolling the stone. Or you know anger is still an issue for you, so you avoid certain conversations or situations while you ask the Holy Spirit to work on your heart. That's rolling the stone. Or you know there's a habit that keeps tripping you up, so you change your routine to avoid certain places or people that feed that habit. That's rolling the stone. You might not have killed the king yet, but you've got it locked up while you finish this fight. Sometimes that's what you have to do. Now look at verse 20. It says, so Joshua and the Israelite army continued the slaughter and completely crushed the enemy. They totally wiped out the 5 armies except for a tiny remnant that managed to reach their fortified towns. Then the Israelites returned safely to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah. After that, no one dared to speak even a word against Israel. So Joshua's fighting these 5 different armies at the same time, and he wins. But let's not forget, he's fighting them because these kings that are hiding in this cave. You see, it's these kings who built the armies. It is these kings who gave these armies the weapons. It's these kings who organized and strategized. So Joshua's in one place having to fight these things that originated from somewhere else. Let me tell you something. Whatever your thing is, it has a root. It came from somewhere, and we've got to get to the root of it. Look at verse 22. Then Joshua says, remove the rocks covering the opening of the cave and bring the 5 kings to me. So they brought the 5 kings out of the cave. When they brought them, Joshua told the commanders of his army, come and put your feet on the kings' necks. And they did as they were told. Now, what's funny about this whole thing is that these same kings were once pursuing Joshua. You see, there comes a time in the fight when God turns the whole thing around, and what used to have its foot on you, you now have your foot on it. But like Joshua, you got to keep fighting. Verse 25, don't ever be afraid or discouraged, Joshua told his men. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord is going to do this to all of your enemies. Then Joshua killed each of the 5 kings and impaled them on 5 sharpened poles where they hung until evening. So you see, even though Joshua was conquering all of the external forces, he knew true victory came when he confronted and conquered what was hiding in the cave. We waste our lives trying to cover up what we will not correct, trying to cover up what we will not confront. Sooner or later, you have to go back to the cave and confront the kings. You can kill the army, but if you don't kill the kings, let me tell you something, the army is going to rise again. Confronting the kings means confronting yourself and looking at what's hiding on the inside of you. It's time to start confronting yourself. Stop blaming everybody else. Confront what needs to be confronted. Correct what needs to be corrected so you can recover what needs to be recovered. The key to your recovery is being willing to confront your kings. Remember, anything you cannot confront, you cannot conquer. So before I leave you, I want you to think about this. What story is God asking you to interrupt right now? What line is he asking you to draw? Where do you need to take back your yes and your no? What king have you left unconquered? It's time to take back your story. And the only way you do that is if you set a boundary, come to the revelation that you matter, and confront your kings.
This concludes another episode of the Call a Thing series on the Hard Truth Podcast with Adam Aziz. If this message challenged or inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. To go even deeper, pick up a copy of Adam's book, Call a Thing at www.adamandolivia.com. Be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button before you go and leave a review. If you have questions or comments you would like to share with Adam, email us at info@adamandolivia.com. And remember, you can't conquer what you won't confront. Until next time, keep calling a thing a thing.